Hello. In this video, I want to respond to Whatifalthist's analysis of colonialism. Okay, so let us start.
However, my dad's side's Irish. We ignore this today, but numerically far more Asians or Europeans were colonized than Native Americans or Africans. The Irish were a colony of the English, where the English killed off the entire native Irish ruling class, attempted genocide, evacuated the Irish from a quarter of their island, replacing it with settlers, forbade the native Irish from voting, owning property, or obtaining an education in their native country. The Irish were brutally oppressed serfs in their own country. On both sides of my family are people who benefited and who took a lot of losses from colonialism. I can already hear people typing, "You're white, it's not the same." This brings up the next point about this debate. The effects of colonialism are heavily politicized today, and talking about it honestly is impossible without causing mass offense and political crying and emotion. The truth gets blurred when politics are in play. The reason people say white people were never colonized in the same way as other ethnicities and people of color is since white people are successful today, even though that was absolutely not true at the time.
Okay, so let us first start with a point of agreement. What happened to the Irish is actually horrible. So when you look at the percentage of the Irish population that died during the Great Potato Famine, and by the way, that famine was caused by the greed of the British landowners and imperialists that conquered Ireland, the percentage of the population killed is actually 15%. And what's interesting, when you look at Mao Zedong's great famines that were caused by his ridiculous policy during the Great Leap Forward, the percentage of the Chinese population that died is actually 4%. So if Ireland happened to be a country that is as numerous as China, British imperialism would have actually killed way more people, like 60 million, potentially 100 million just in Ireland. But okay, so, and both me and Whatifalthist, we have something in common. He says that his ancestors were victims of British imperialism. Well, since I'm from Croatia, Croatia was throughout history also much closer to being a colony than to being a colonial superpower. I mean, during the early modern age, Croatia was conquered by the Ottomans. Many Croatian people were taken as slaves. And then later, when Austro-Hungary reconquered the territory that was conquered by Ottomans, well, Croatia, okay, Croatian people then weren't taken as slaves, but they were economically exploited. So yeah, I agree with his broader point that Europeans did horrible stuff to each other, potentially even, let's say, equally bad as they did to their colonial subjects. But okay, there is something interesting that he says at the end of this clip, and that is that people claim that it is not the same to be colonized in Europe because Europeans today are doing better than people in, let's say, former British and French colonies in Africa or in Asia. Well, okay, I would even agree with that statement, but let us analyze why is the situation so much worse in Africa, for example. The thing is, when colonial empires were forced to leave from Africa, they left the borders in a very unnatural way. While in Europe, the borders were kind of formed naturally as a result of a bunch of wars and ethnic cleansings. Homogeneous states were finally created in Europe throughout the 20th century. But in Africa, the maps were drawn, and often quite deliberately, in a way that screwed with the local population. For example, the French gave parts of Syria to Lebanon in order to create animosities and to control the population more easily. And yeah, precisely because maps were drawn in such an unnatural way that disrespected the local religion and ethnicity, wars are so prominent in both Africa and the Middle East. For example, if you look at Iraq, they're really isn't much sense in constructing a country that in it has both the Kurds, the Shiites, and the Sunnis. The map was divided in such a way simply because British and the French couldn't agree who is going to get more oil after World War One, and that is why the maps of the Middle East were drawn in a way that gave, let's say, roughly speaking, an equal amount of oil both to the British and the French. But okay, let us continue with this video.
There were some really nasty colonial events. These include the British famines in India, which killed 30 million people, in which there was no parallel either before or after British colonization. Leopold's conquest of the Congo had 8 million deaths, truly making it one of the most brutal events in all of history, since that was a little bit less than half of the Congo's population. Then the entire European colonization of the New World killed around 15 million people, almost all of whom were concentrated during the Spanish colonization of Mexico or Peru. Finally, the Atlantic slave trade had a similar death toll around 15 million. These are horrible numbers, and I don't want to discount that the people who lived through these, it was a horrifying tragedy, but there's nothing particularly abnormal about them. The Muslim slave trade, unlike the European, killed around 20 million people. The Muslims had their own empires with genocides, such as the Armenians or Jews, or the brutal invasion of India. 8 out of the 10 bloodiest wars in history were fought in China, and the Japanese have also been brutal colonizers, killing 20 million. The medieval Mongols killed staggering numbers of people, approaching 80 million. The great irony is that for the last few decades, the biggest critics of colonialism have been Marxists, but they score so much worse than colonialism. Mao killed 40 million people, Stalin 20 million, and other communists over 20 million. Marxists criticizing colonialism for being bloodthirsty is the pot calling the kettle black. However, another point here is the Europeans have killed far, far more of each other than people of color.
Okay, so this isn't an unreasonable take, what we just heard, but let me just insert a few truth bombs. So, what's interesting about the Marxist critique of colonialism is that Marx makes an argument that colonialism in the long run is harmful for the European nations themselves, and he argues in the Communist Manifesto that actually as long as capitalist colonialism exists, there will be huge wars like the 7-Year War, for example, that happened in the 18th century. World War One was, one could say, a repetition of the 7 Years' War, just with better technology. And World War II, while it might sound like a controversial thing to say, was also, largely speaking, a war for the colonies. At least from a Japanese and Italian perspective, it was a war in which Japan and Italy tried to take colonies from Britain and France. There is that famous Hitler quote, "There is a great injustice in the world, and that injustice is the fact that the British hold 40% of the surface of the earth." So Hitler, when he spoke of injustice, he didn't want to free the colonies, he just wanted to conquer them largely for himself. But okay, Whatifalthist here says that it is hypocritical of communists to kind of complain about the capitalist colonialism because they killed more people, but I'm actually not really sure that they killed more people, because it all depends on how you count the dead. I mean, on his death count of colonialism, he never mentions World War One. And World War One was a direct consequence of colonialism that killed 20 million Europeans, and then there was a Spanish flu that occurred as a consequence of bad hygiene and a lack of food that appeared in the destroyed environment of World War One. And that's 20 million people that died from the Spanish flu. So we are already at 40 million just from World War One. But if we are to say that that doesn't count because those deaths are indirectly caused by colonialism, well, then most of the people killed by the communists also don't count, because most people under Mao Zedong died because he caused famines, and then famines caused disease. So the very same critique could be applied there. But what's also funny is that actually both sides were hypocritical when you look at history. I mean, every time that somebody would criticize the Soviets for killing their own workers in a state that was allegedly a dictatorship of the proletariat, the Soviets had that famous line, and you lynch black people, they would say to the Americans all throughout the 1950s and 1960s. So the sad reality is actually that both sides are hypocritical, and not just the communists, because yes, while Churchill did cry about and complain about how communism is horrible for the people of Eastern Europe, which it was, he never said a single thing about Indian people that died as a result of the Bengal famine. So how is that not hypocritical? But okay, I'm assuming that we can both agree then that just both sides were hypocritical and not just one side.
As I've said before, the West isn't special for practicing slavery. Most societies have. It is for abolishing it. The West was the only society that felt guilty for its actions and changed, which is something we forget today. We're confused in that we think the world just magically became moral. The moral arc of history doesn't exist, we make it happen. In the 20th century, the Nazis and Soviets practiced the largest slavery and mass death ever. Social justice is trying to drag us back to witch burnings and medieval senses of heresy and clear of good versus evil. In John Gunter's book, where he traveled around 1950s Africa, and he was famous, so he was able to interview all the most important figures in every society, and he would ask these British officials, you put a lot of effort into educating the native peoples, but then the second they become educated, they suddenly become nationalists and start lobbying for independence. And the British officials will say, we do it because it's the right thing to do, and whether or not they become nationalists is their private choice as individuals. And that kind of sense doesn't exist in any other societies, and we need to give the British credit for that. In any other society...
Well, actually, the exactly same thing happened in one other society, the Soviet Union. So the Soviets actually created the Azerbaijani nation, the Turkmenistan nation, the Tajikistan nation. All those nations, before the Soviets occupied them, were just a collection of tribes, often fighting each other because of blood vengeance. But under Stalin and Lenin, actually, the Azerbaijani nation becomes a nation and unites the tribes, and then precisely the same thing happened. Those very same nations started to demand independence, and they end up getting that very same independence. Okay, but let us
in history, Gandhi's attempt to shame the British through peaceful non-resistance would have just resulted in him getting hanged by the British government. The fact that that didn't happen suggests a morally much more advanced regime than almost anything else in history. The West did something genuinely great in changing itself for the better and becoming humanitarian, but as other eras of history would have immediately told us, kindness doesn't get you much love in international politics. Countries don't praise the West for this, since there are rivals, and they won't love us no matter what we do. That's not how international relations work. Iran and China will always call us the Great Satan, no matter how nice we are. The descendants of the people who freed the slaves and peacefully liberated the colonies shit on them for not going far enough, while they did some of those generous acts in history. Kindness turned to weakness in the West. The language of politics is and will always be power and force, no matter how much we don't want to believe that. We have forgotten that strength is the language of politics. I'll send you all a collective hug at the end of this video, since I think y'all need it.
Well, okay, Whatifalthist says something interesting. He says that in the West, kindness has become weakness. And okay, let me just drop another truth bomb. While it is truly remarkable that, for example, European colonialist empires were willing to give some pretty large territories without a fight. For example, India. There was no Indian War of Independence against the British. But why is that? Well, that happened because Churchill miraculously lost the election after defeating Hitler, and the Labour Party was much more, I won't use the term anti-colonial, but they definitely weren't as pro-colonial as Churchill. And so the British Labour Party decided to say, well, okay, we'll just let India go, we have too many other shit to do. Too many other problems, and they were focused on, for example, giving free homes to the British people and free healthcare, and that's why they didn't have money to wage a war on India. But also, I mean, colonialism, while in some aspects it did peacefully cease to exist. For example, India and other countries, for example, Israel relatively peacefully gained its independence from the British. But in many other parts of the world, there were horrible and brutal wars fought for decades. Algeria, Vietnam. And all these wars wouldn't have been won without Stalin and Mao Zedong sending quite a lot of guns to those nations. And that's what's absurd about Maoism. The dude was starving his own people in order to send 8% of his GDP to Vietnam and Africa. But okay, let me just end with an optimistic notion about the Western world. While I agree that it is cringe to be too self-critical, I would still rather live in a society that is a bit too self-critical than in a society like, for example, Erdogan's Turkey or Putin's Russia, that are not only ashamed of their former imperialism, but they want to imitate it. They want to once again return to the glorious past when their countries were imperial superpowers. So if the alternative is to take pride in your imperialism, then I think it is a bit better to be self-critical. Because, I mean, after all, yeah, wokeness and all that stuff is cringe, but if you look at the quote-unquote non-woke countries as Russia and Turkey, well, you don't have a freedom of speech there. There, you won't just get cancelled, you'll go to jail. So, and it appears to me that there is practically no healthy alternative between those two positions. Well, maybe actually Eastern Europe, which is where I live, is a healthier alternative between the two. But some people will still complain that even Croatia is woke today because it's in a Western sphere of influence. But okay, my message to Whatifalthist is that it is probably better to be too critical of your own past than obsessed with restoring the glorious past, because that is exactly the same thing that all the fascist regimes did. And in fact, Umberto Eco even names this dangerous obsession with the glorious past one of the crucial points that make fascism fascism. Okay, that's all for this video, and if you liked it, don't forget to like and subscribe, and see you in the next video.